Welcome. I want you to forget the stories you were told as a child, erase the charming fable of the kind-hearted bell ringer and the beautiful dancer who taught him the meaning of friendship. That story is a comfortable lie, a sweet confection designed to hide a rot so deep it corrupts the very stone of its setting. The truth is not a romance. It is a meticulous chronicle of obsession, a clinical study in the disintegration of a soul. We are not here to talk of love, but of the damnation that lurks behind a pious mask, of a beauty so profound it becomes a curse, attracting monsters who seek to possess and destroy it. In the shadow of Notre Dame, the holiest of sanctuaries, you will not find salvation. You will only find a meticulously constructed hell and the terrified girl who was condemned to walk its corridors. Her name was Esmeralda, and her only sin was a tragic, heartbreaking naivety. She moved through the grimy streets of Paris like a flash of vibrant silk, a creature of sunlight and music in a world of gray stone and muted suffering. Her belief in the inherent goodness of people was not a virtue. It was a fatal vulnerability, a desperate, childlike faith in a just world that had never existed. She saw kindness where there was only calculation, love where there was only lust. This profound hope, this certainty that purity would be rewarded and that she had control over her own destiny, was the delicate thread from which her reality was woven. It was a thread that the city's lurking spiders were already preparing to unravel, piece by agonizing piece, until she was left with nothing but the cold, stark truth of her own objectification. The Paris she danced in was not a city of light, but a labyrinth of perpetual twilight, its narrow streets choked with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale wine, and the ever-present dampness of the Seine. Above it all loomed the cathedral, Notre Dame, less a house of God and more a stone behemoth crouched over the city. Its shadow was a physical presence, a chilling weight that fell upon the populace. The air within its walls tasted of cold dust and centuries of whispered confessions, the smell of cloying incense failing to mask an undercurrent of decay. Its silence was not peaceful, but heavy and watchful, broken only by the mournful tolling of bells that seemed to count down the seconds to some inevitable looming doom. It was a place that promised heaven, while its very foundation seemed rooted in the earth of the grave. The breaking point came in the public square, a theater of cruelty where justice was a spectator sport. Falsely accused, Esmeralda stood on the scaffold, the jeering roar of the crowd a physical blow against her skin. The air was thick with the metallic tang of her own fear, a sour taste that coated her tongue as she looked upon the leering faces eager for her death. In that moment, her art, her life, her very name were stripped away, leaving only the raw, primal terror of an animal caught in a snare. The world contracted to the rough wood beneath her feet and the coarse rope awaiting her neck. It was here, in this pit of public degradation, that the first promise of false salvation appeared, a grotesque angel descending not from heaven, but from the cathedral's stony peaks to snatch her from the jaws of one fate and deliver her to another far worse. With a powerful roar, the hunchback Quasimodo swept her from the executioner's grasp, carrying her through the parting sea of astonished citizens and into the gaping maw of the cathedral. "Sanctuary!" he cried, the word echoing off the ancient stones. For Esmeralda, gasping for breath against his deformed chest, the word was a miracle, a divine intervention. She willingly crossed the threshold, believing she had been delivered into the arms of God's protection. But this was her true transgression, the fatal misstep from which there could be no return. The heavy doors boomed shut behind her, the sound not of safety, but of a cage being locked. She had not escaped her prison. She had merely exchanged a public scaffold for a private holy dungeon, where her captor and tormentor was now the absolute master of her world. The first days in her stone chamber were a blur of echoing silence and suffocating solitude. The initial frantic relief of her rescue curdled quickly into a low, persistent dread. This was not a haven. It was a cage, albeit one with a higher ceiling. The cold of the cathedral floor seeped into her bones, an unshakable chill that no amount of rough-spun blanket could ward off. Sunlight was a distant concept, filtering in muted, hazy shafts through the stained-glass saints who watched her with placid, uncaring eyes. The air she breathed was heavy and still, thick with the ghosts of forgotten prayers and the faint, sweet smell of rot from somewhere deep within the structure. She felt less like a person granted asylum and more like a specimen pinned under glass, observed by an unseen collector. Her only regular visitor was the hunchback, Quasimodo. He would appear without a sound, a grotesque silhouette in the doorway, leaving bread and water on the floor before retreating back into the belfry's shadows. She could not find it in her heart to see him as her savior. His misshapen form, his single, sorrowful eye, and his animalistic shyness only served as a constant living reminder of her own precarious situation. He was a creature of this place, as much a part of its oppressive architecture as the gargoyles. His kindness, if it could be called that, felt like the incidental affection a zookeeper might show a captured, exotic bird. She feared him, she pitied him, but most of all, she saw in him the reflection of her own imprisonment, a soul trapped within a monstrous shell. The true source of her terror, however, remained unseen. It was a presence she felt in the unnerving stillness between the tolling of the bells, a malevolent intelligence that seemed to permeate the very stones around her. She would spend hours staring at the heavy oak door of her room, her body tensed, waiting for a footstep that was not the heavy, shuffling gait of the bell ringer. Her naivety had been cauterized on the public scaffold, replaced by the raw, exposed nerve of animal instinct. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the man who held the keys to this holy prison was not God, but a devil who wore the robes of a priest, and that he was merely waiting, watching, and biding his time. Her hope, once a blazing fire, was now a guttering candle flame, flickering in the ceaseless draught of her fear. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of her small circular room. The vibrant sounds and smells of the Parisian streets were replaced by the monotonous drone of liturgical chants from the nave below, and the distant, lonely cry of gulls circling the spire. She would trace the patterns in the stone with a trembling finger, trying to remember the feeling of grass under her bare feet, the warmth of the sun on her face. These memories became torturous, ghosts of a life so completely severed from her present that it might as well have belonged to someone else. Her sanity began to fray, her thoughts circling in a tightening gyre of paranoia and despair. Then he came. She heard the footsteps first, not heavy and clumsy like Quasimodo's, but measured, soft, and deliberate on the stone stairs. The sound sent a jolt of ice through her veins. The scent arrived next, a strange mingling of cold, sterile incense and the sour, repressed sweat of a man engaged in a constant war with his own body. The door creaked open, and Archdeacon Claude Frollo filled the frame. a pillar of black wool sucking all the meager light from the room. He did not look at her, not at first. He simply stood there, his presence an absolute negation of the word sanctuary, his silence a suffocating weight that crushed the very air from her lungs. He began to speak, his voice a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate in the stone. He spoke of God, of sin, of the sacred duty to cleanse the soul of its impurities. He painted himself as a martyr, a man of faith tormented by a temptation sent by Satan himself. And she, he explained with chilling calm, was that temptation. He was gaslighting her on a cosmic scale, framing his own monstrous desires as a holy tribulation for which she, with her bewitching dance and godless beauty, was solely responsible. She was not a girl, not a victim, but a living embodiment of sin, a vessel of damnation sent to test his piety and drag his soul into the fires of hell. His sermon of self-pity twisted into something far more venomous. The scriptural justifications fell away, replaced by the raw, fevered language of obsession. He described in grotesque detail the nights he spent writhing in his cell. Her image burned into his mind. He spoke of her skin, her hair, her movements, not with the tenderness of a lover, but with the clinical consuming hunger of a scholar dissecting a specimen. The lust he had repressed for a lifetime came pouring out of him in a torrent of profane confession, each word a violation, a defilement of the sacred space he commanded. Esmeralda could only listen, paralyzed, as the most powerful man in her world confessed that he saw her not as a soul to be saved, but as an object to be possessed. When he finished, a terrible silence descended. He stared at her, his eyes glowing with a fanatic's fire, waiting for her response as if he had just proposed a holy sacrament. Her mind, reeling from the onslaught of his madness, could form only one response: revulsion. She shrank back from him, a small choked sound of disgust escaping her lips. It was a minuscule act of defiance, but it was enough. The last thin veneer of his control shattered. The pious mask did not slip. It disintegrated, revealing the contorted face of a monster, his features twisted into a snarl of pure predatory rage. In his eyes she saw her rejection not as a defense, but as the final unforgivable confirmation of her wickedness. He lunged. It was not the clumsy fumbling of a man unused to passion, but the swift, brutal attack of a predator claiming its prey. The air was forced from her lungs as he slammed her against the cold stone wall. His hands, no longer cold and dry but clammy with a feverish sweat, clawed at her dress, the rough wool of his cassock scratching her skin like sandpaper. The smell of him was overwhelming. Incense, old parchment, and the acrid stench of his unholy desire. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the cavernous emptiness of the cathedral. Here, in the supposed heart of God's mercy, a blasphemous, violent act was unfolding, and there was no one to hear, no one to save her. Just as her vision began to tunnel into darkness, the attack ceased. Quasimodo stood in the doorway, his powerful form blocking the light, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Frollo, his face a mask of incandescent fury, straightened his robes and spat a curse, not at Esmeralda, but at the hunchback who had dared to interrupt him. He gave Esmeralda one last look, a look that promised this was not over, that this was merely a postponement, and then he was gone, his quiet footsteps receding, leaving an even more terrifying silence in their wake. Esmeralda slid down the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably, the sanctity of her prison forever and irrevocably violated. The world was now divided into two states of being, the moments when Frollo was gone, and the moments when he might return. The attack had destroyed the last vestiges of her childlike worldview. The church was not a sanctuary. It was his personal hunting ground. God was not watching over her. He was an absent landlord who had leased his property to a monster. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant clang of a closing gate sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She was an animal in a cage, and the keeper had just shown her precisely what he intended to do with her. There was no hope of mercy, only the certainty of his return. Sleep became a luxury she could not afford, a treacherous country from which she might not return in time to defend herself. When exhaustion finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with his cold eyes and the smell of incense. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom sensation of his hands still on her skin. She began to see his face in the swirling patterns of the stone, to hear his voice in the sighing of the wind through the bell tower. He was no longer just a man. He had become a haunting, an insidious presence that was beginning to colonize her very mind, breaking down the walls between memory and reality. Quasimodo continued to bring her food, but now his presence was an agony. Was he her protector or her jailer? His intervention had saved her from the rape, but he was still Frollo's creature, bound to the archdeacon by a lifetime of dependence and fear. She looked into his one eye and saw a reflection of her own helplessness. He was as much a prisoner of this place and its master as she was. She could not trust him, could not confide in him. He was just another piece of the grotesque, incomprehensible machinery of her damnation, and his silent, pitying gaze felt more like a judgment than a comfort. Weeks bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of dread and waiting. Then Frollo returned, but it was a different man who stood in her doorway. His face was etched with remorse, his voice soft, and filled with a convincing imitation of shame. He did not approach her, but spoke from a distance, confessing the depths of his sin, begging for a forgiveness he claimed he did not deserve. He told her that he had been wrestling with his demons and that he could not bear to see her imprisoned any longer. He told her he had arranged for her escape, a secret way out of the cathedral where she could flee Paris forever. Her first instinct was to recoil, to see the lie coiled behind the soft words. The memory of his assault was a fresh, raw wound, yet the alternative was an eternity in this room, waiting for his madness to consume him and her completely. The promise of freedom, of the sky, of life itself, was a lure too powerful to resist. His contrition seemed so plausible, his plan so detailed. A hidden door, a boatman waiting at the river's edge, a purse of coins for her journey, a desperate, foolish sliver of hope began to embed itself in her heart, a tiny seed of trust planted in the poisoned soil of her despair. It was a foolish hope, she knew, but it was the only thing she had left. She spent the next day in a state of feverish anxiety, her mind torn between terror and a wild, burgeoning excitement. Could it be true? Could this monster truly have found a shred of conscience? The thought of feeling the night air on her skin again, of escaping this stone tomb, was so intoxicating that it began to eclipse the rational part of her brain that screamed it was a trap. Hope, she was learning, was a far more insidious and painful torture than despair. It made you vulnerable. It made you weak. It made you willing to believe the most beautiful lies, even when they were told by the very devil who had orchestrated your ruin. The night of the escape arrived, thick with a damp, river-chilled fog. Frollo appeared as promised, a hooded cloak in his hands. He led her not up towards the bell tower, but down into the deep, dark underbelly of the cathedral. The air grew thick with the smell of mold and damp earth, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the oppressive blackness. He held a single, flickering lantern, which cast monstrous, dancing shadows on the sweating stone walls. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and desperate, soaring hope. She followed the bobbing light, her guide and tormentor, deeper into the labyrinth beneath the house of God. They moved through crypts where the bones of long-dead bishops slept in their stone sarcophagi, through forgotten cellars filled with discarded relics. The journey felt endless, a descent into the very bowels of the earth. At last, he stopped before a small iron-banded door, half hidden behind a stack of rotting wine barrels. He produced a large rusted key, and with a groan of protesting metal, the lock turned. He pushed the door open, revealing a sliver of the night, the glint of water, and the smell of the river. Freedom was inches away, a tangible, breathable thing. She could almost taste it. She stepped through the doorway, her feet sinking into the soft mud of the riverbank. She saw it then. The small skiff tied to a post, just as he had described. The fog was thick, shrouding the opposite bank in mystery. For one beautiful, crystalline moment, she felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had made it. She was free. She turned to look at Frollo one last time, a strange, conflicted feeling of gratitude warring with her hatred. It was then that she saw the smile on his face, a thin, cruel curve of his lips illuminated by the lantern light. It was a smile of absolute, triumphant cruelty. From the fog, shadows detached themselves, coalescing into the forms of the king's guards, their pikes leveled at her chest. They had been waiting. The boat, the key, the secret passage. It was all an elaborate piece of theater, a game designed for his own sick amusement. The realization struck her not like a physical blow, but like the slow, creeping paralysis of a deadly poison. He had not offered her freedom. He had offered her the illusion of it, only to prove to her that he, and he alone, was the master of her reality. He controlled the prison, and he controlled the escape. The hope that had sustained her, that had made her heart beat with frantic life only moments before, did not just die. It was brutally murdered, leaving behind a void so vast and so cold that it threatened to swallow her whole. This was a cruelty far deeper than physical violence. He had taken her last, most precious possession, the possibility of a future, and had casually crushed it before her eyes just to watch her suffer. As the guards seized her arms, their grips like iron bands, she looked at Frollo and saw not a man, not even a monster, but an architect of despair, a craftsman of psychological ruin. She was not returned to her room in the tower. Instead, they dragged her to a different place, a true dungeon deep beneath the Palais de Justice. It was a place of utter sensory deprivation, a hole carved out of the earth where light and sound went to die. The air was a putrid cocktail of human waste, stagnant water, and raw despair. The only sound was the constant, maddening drip of water from the ceiling, each drop a tick of a clock counting down to nothing. Here, there were no stained glass saints, no tolling bells, only cold, wet stone and an all-consuming darkness that was absolute. Time ceased to exist. Was it hours? Days? She lost track. The darkness became her only companion, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in on her from all sides. Her mind, already fragile, began to splinter. She would hold conversations with her goat, Jolly, only to realize with a fresh wave of grief that he was long gone. The memory of Frollo's triumphant smile became a recurring hallucination, projected onto the black canvas of her prison. Her hope had been extinguished, her body was caged, and now her sanity was unraveling. The last fortress of her identity crumbling under the relentless siege of isolation and terror. When he finally appeared, he was little more than a silhouette against the torchlight from the corridor, a shape of darkness made manifest. The pretense of the holy man was gone forever. He no longer smelled of incense, but of the damp earth of the grave. He did not speak of sin or salvation. He had moved beyond such justifications. His voice, when it came, was stripped of all emotion, a flat, dead tone that held the finality of a judge's sentence. He was here not to torment her, but to conclude the transaction he had initiated the day he first laid eyes upon her. He presented his ultimatum with the cold, dispassionate clarity of a man stating a law of nature. At dawn, the gallows would be ready for her in the Place de Grève. Her death was a certainty. However, he was offering her one final alternative path. She could choose to give herself to him, to submit her body to his will completely and without resistance. If she did, he would arrange for a pardon. He was not asking. He was dictating the terms of her existence, total violation or total annihilation. The choice, he said with a voice devoid of any human feeling, was hers. The two options hung in the suffocating darkness of her cell, two distinct and equally monstrous fates. One was the sharp, final agony of the rope, an obliteration of the self. The other was a living death, an endless continuation of her violation, becoming the property of the man who had systematically destroyed her. She thought of her life before him, the simple joy of the dance, the warmth of a cheering crowd, the uncomplicated love for her pet goat. It all seemed like a story told about a stranger. He had already killed that girl. Now he was merely asking her to choose the method for disposing of the body. In the end, there was no real choice to make. To submit to him would be the final act of her own destruction, a surrender of the last tiny piece of her soul that she could still call her own. To die was to deny him his ultimate prize. Her refusal was not a shout of heroic defiance, but a barely audible whisper, a broken sound forced from a throat raw with unshed tears. No, it was the last word of hers that mattered, the final assertion of her will against his. It was the only victory she could possibly achieve in this world, and its price was her life. He did not rage, he did not argue. A low, guttural chuckle was his only response. It was the sound of a game master who has just watched his opponent make the final, predictable, losing move. He had won. He had forced her into a position where her only act of self-preservation was to choose her own death. He had orchestrated her despair so perfectly that she would now willingly walk to the gallows he had prepared for her. He turned and left without another word, the heavy cell door booming shut, sealing her in the darkness. And from the courtyard above, she could hear it, the steady, rhythmic hammering of the carpenters, building her cross. Dawn broke not with color, but with a slow dilution of the darkness, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Esmeralda was led from her cell, her movements stiff, her eyes vacant. The morning air was sharp and cold, a cruel reminder of the life she was about to leave. The streets were already lined with a jostling, eager mob, their faces a pale, featureless sea of morbid curiosity. She did not see them as people. They were simply part of the landscape of her final moments, no different from the cobblestones under her bare, numb feet or the gray, indifferent sky above. The world had taken on the quality of a dream, a slow, inexorable procession from which she was a detached observer, watching the death of a girl who used to be her. She walked with a strange, hollowed-out placidity, the final gift of absolute despair. Her body was merely a shell being escorted to its disposal. She felt the rough texture of the executioner's hand on her arm, heard the jeers and pious condemnations from the crowd, but the sounds were muffled, distant, as if coming from across a great body of water. Her senses, once so alive to the world, had shut down, a final defense against a reality too brutal to endure. All that remained was a single, clear image in her mind. The memory of dancing in a sunlit square, the happy jingle of her tambourine, the only sound in the world. It was a ghost from another life, a final flickering candle against the encroaching absolute dark. At the center of the Place de Grève, the gallows stood stark and skeletal against the morning sky. It looked like a crudely drawn finger, pointing an accusation at God. As they placed the coarse, stiff rope around her neck, her gaze drifted upward, past the sea of faces, past the rooftops, to the one place that had been both her prison and her world. She saw the twin towers of Notre Dame, silent and immense, its stone facade impassive. And there, on the highest gallery, she could just make out two small figures, one large and misshapen, the other straight and black. They were watching her, and in that moment, she knew that her death, like her life, was to be a spectacle for her tormentor. High above the square, Quasimodo watched the scene unfold with an agony that threatened to tear his deformed body apart. He saw the girl, so small and fragile from this height, being led like a lamb to the altar. His mind was a maelstrom of confusion and grief. He loved her, for she was the only creature who had ever shown him a shred of kindness. But he also loved his master, the archdeacon, the only man who had ever given him shelter, a name, a purpose. He could not reconcile the two realities, the gentle girl below and the cold, silent man standing beside him, whose hand he could feel resting almost affectionately on the stone parapet as he watched the proceedings below. Frollo was preternaturally calm. There was no trace of the frenzied creature who had attacked Esmeralda in her cell, nor the contrite penitent who had offered her false hope. The man who watched the gallows was something else entirely, a being who had passed through the crucible of his obsession and emerged on the other side, purified and serene. His long war with his own flesh was over. He was about to witness the ultimate consummation of his desire, not through possession, but through annihilation. By destroying the object of his lust, he was performing a final, ecstatic act of self-control, cauterizing the wound she had opened in his soul. He was not murdering a girl, he was killing a part of himself, and it was bringing him a profound, unholy peace. As the executioner kicked the stool from under Esmeralda's feet, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. Quasimodo let out a choked animal sound of despair, turning away, unable to watch. But Frollo did not flinch. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the sight, his knuckles white where he gripped the balustrade. He watched her body drop, the sickening snap of the neck lost in the noise of the square. He watched the brutal, spasmodic convulsions, the final, frantic dance of a nervous system fighting against its own extinction. He watched until the last tremor ceased, and she hung limp and still, a broken puppet swinging gently in the morning breeze. And then, A sound drifted up from the parapet, a sound more horrific than any scream. It was a laugh. It started as a low chuckle, a dry, rasping sound from deep within Frollo's chest, and it grew into a full-throated demonic cackle of pure, triumphant release. It was the laugh of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it to his liking. It was the sound of a soul not damned, but gleefully casting itself into the flames. In that moment of unholy ecstasy, he had achieved his final victory, a perfect, nihilistic union with the object of his obsession through her utter destruction. That sound shattered the world for Quasimodo. The lifetime of loyalty, of fear, of filial devotion to his master evaporated in that single, monstrous peal of laughter. He turned and saw not the priest who had raised him, but a devil wearing his master's face, exulting in the death of the only beautiful thing the hunchback had ever known. A rage, primal and absolute, erupted from the core of his being. It was not a thought, it was a physical force, a tidal wave of grief and betrayal that demanded release. He roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and launched himself at the laughing archdeacon. Frollo barely had time to register the attack. The look of ecstatic triumph on his face was replaced by one of stunned disbelief as Quasimodo's powerful hands closed around his body. The struggle was brief and desperate, a frantic dance on the edge of the world. For a moment, they were silhouetted against the gray sky, the deformed creature and his creator locked in a final, fatal embrace. Frollo clawed at the hunchback's face, but his strength was nothing against the pure, concentrated fury of a lifetime of pain. Finally unleashed, Quasimodo, with a final guttural scream, heaved the archdeacon up and over the stone railing. For a moment, Frollo clung to the guttering, his eyes wide with the sudden stark terror of a man who had orchestrated his own damnation, but had never truly expected to pay the price. He stared up at Quasimodo, his mouth opening to plead, to command, but no sound came out. Quasimodo simply looked down at him, his one eye filled with a sorrow so profound it eclipsed his rage, and then he looked away, toward the gallows. Frollo's grip failed, and he fell. Quasimodo did not watch the body twist and turn on its long journey down, but he heard the final, wet thud as it met the paving stones of the square far below. A great, unnatural silence seemed to settle over the cathedral. Below, the crowd, having witnessed one death and then another, began to disperse, their appetite for spectacle sated for the day. Frollo was dead. Esmeralda was dead. Quasimodo stood alone on the parapet, the cold wind whipping around him, the king of a silent, empty castle. This was his victory, and it was made of nothing but ash and bone. He had destroyed his master and lost his only friend. He was completely, irrevocably, and eternally alone, a monstrous gargoyle given life, condemned to watch over a world that had nothing left in it for him. He looked from the broken form of Frollo on the stones to the still hanging body of Esmeralda on the gallows, and he understood they were the two halves of his world, the torment and the tenderness, and now both were gone. One had been consumed by a love that had festered into madness, the other destroyed by it, and he, the monster caught between them, was the sole survivor, the lonely inheritor of their shared ruin. There was no justice in this. There was no victory. There was only the vast, echoing emptiness of the belfry and the profound silence of a world without bells. Years passed. The story of the Romani dancer and the mad priest faded into just another grim Parisian legend. The cathedral endured, its stones holding the secret of the tragedy within their cold embrace. One day, The city authorities decided to clear the mass grave at Montfaucon, a pit where the unclaimed bodies of criminals and the indigent were unceremoniously dumped. Workmen shoveling through the centuries of decay and forgotten bones uncovered something peculiar, something that made them stop and fall silent in the dusty, charnel house air. They found two skeletons locked in a final, inseparable embrace. One was clearly female, its form delicate, the vertebrae of the neck grotesquely broken and twisted to one side. The other skeleton was wrapped around it, clinging to it with a fierce possessiveness. Its spine was horribly contorted, its limbs long and powerful. It was the skeleton of a hunchback, holding the object of its affection even in the communal squalor of the grave. When one of the workmen tried to gently pry the two skeletons apart, the bones of the hunchback, deprived of the only thing they had to hold, instantly crumbled into a fine gray dust. And now you know the truth. There was no heroic victory, no lesson learned. There was only the absolute consuming power of a corrupt obsession and the innocent life it devoured. The story does not end with the villain's defeat, but with the quiet horror of a lonely creature starving to death in a pit of corpses, clinging to the rotting remains of his only love. The evil was not vanquished. It simply burned out, taking everyone with it. The real monster was never the one with the twisted spine, but the one with the righteous soul. And the sanctuary of God was nothing more than a theater for the devil's favorite play.